This video is a part of Project Homecoming. Be sure to check out all the videos from all your favorite history YouTubers in the playlist. In the United States, the national government is divided into three branches: the executive, judicial, and legislative, represented by the president, the federal courts, and Congress. At the state level, this model is also repeated in the form of governors, state courts, and the state legislatures. And it is common for the legislature to be further divided into upper and lower chambers, known locally as the state Senate and the state House of Representatives. And this is true across much of the United States, except for the state of Nebraska, which is the only state to have just one chamber in the modern day. Known locally as the Unicameral, it is composed of just 49 members, making it the smallest state legislature in the country, as opposed to the largest state legislature in New Hampshire, which has over 400 members in the lower house alone. Now, having just one chamber of government can be seen as being a little odd to many people in the United States, as variations of the two-chamber system have been the most common form of legislature adopted by most US states, as well as other former English colonies, such as Canada, Australia, and India. However, even though it's widespread today, it wasn't always the case, with unicameral systems having existed across the United States ever since the early colonial period, with Vermont most notably having just one chamber of government for about the first 50 years of its history as a state, until 1836. Over time, following the example of the federal government, many states began to adopt the two-chamber system we are familiar with today. Nebraska reversed that trend, however, by adopting a unicameral system in 1937, after several decades of local activists and politicians attempting to reform the two-chamber system of the state. Now, this wasn't too unique, as during the early 1900s, there were several movements calling for unicameral reforms across several states in the US, and much of this was wrapped up in the reforms that occurred during the late 18th and early 19th century, as part of the progressive movement, which called for greater governmental accountability, equal rights for women, banning alcohol, as well as increased labor protections. And while the Midwest and the Great Plains are seen as being much more conservative, in 2023, during the early 1900s and earlier, these areas of the US is where many early progressive reforms were enacted, with the Wyoming Territory being the first place in the US to give full voting rights to women, all the way back in 1869, Montana being the first state to elect a woman to the House, and South Dakota being the first state to elect a woman to the Senate. Nebraska followed in this tradition by enacting a series of progressive reforms, including a prohibition on alcohol and allowing women to vote in presidential and local elections, with the state going on to largely support the 18th Amendment to the US Constitution, which prohibited the sale or manufacture of alcohol nationwide, and the 19th Amendment, which gave full voting rights to women across the US. As a result of these calls for reform, Nebraska eventually decided to hold a constitutional convention for themselves in December of 1919 to update their state constitution, as it had been largely modeled on the old constitution of the neighboring state of Iowa back in the mid-1800s. During the convention, a Democrat named John N. Norton was able to introduce and get a vote on a constitutional amendment which would have combined the existing state Senate and House into one unicameral legislature. However, the amendment failed to pass due to the vote being tied, 43 to 43, and a further petition in 1923 calling for the unicameral also failed to get enough popular support. Leading into the 1930s, public support for a unicameral system began to increase again, and is largely credited to the activism of Nebraska Senator George W. Norris, who was a progressive Republican, known for supporting governmental reforms, such as the direct election of senators by popular vote, abolishing the Electoral College, and increasing the negotiating power of labor unions. Norris, as a Republican who would go on to frequently work with Democrats, such as Henry Wallace and President Franklin Roosevelt, he largely disliked the two-chamber system as he saw it as leading to increased partisanship. He also frequently criticized the conference committee system, which he saw as acting as almost a third chamber of government. When there are two chambers in a legislature, in order to pass new laws, both bills must have the exact same wording before it can be signed into law by the governor. Therefore, if a bill is passed in one chamber, it is then sent to the other chamber for consideration. Here, they can choose to accept it, modify it, or entirely reject the wording of the bill. If it is modified, it is then sent back to the original chamber, who can then accept it, modify it, or reject it. This cycle then repeats, until either both bills have the same wording in both chambers, and is then sent to the executive, or one chamber rejects it entirely. However, there's another option available, and that is the conference committee system. This is where if a bill passes in both houses with different wording and needs to be modified, members of both chambers come together to form a conference committee to have formal meetings and informal negotiations to edit the bill so that it can be acceptable to both chambers of government. This saves time by having the changes be done all at once, instead of having to send it back and forth, which could take several weeks, months, or even years to work out. And while Norris criticized the secret nature of the conference committee system, it looks like it was not the norm for bills to be sent to committee in the Nebraska legislature in the years leading up to the 1930s, as only about 10% of bills ended up going to conference committees in the 1920s. And it seems to have been done largely out of convenience, as out of the 113 days that the legislature would meet, almost half of all conference committees occurred during the last 10 days of the session, with that number jumping up to almost 70% during the last 20 days. So it would appear that these politicians were just trying to make sure that the legislation they passed actually ended up becoming law by negotiating with their opponents, instead of having it take years of back and forth to pass the legislature. In spite of this, when the question of reducing the two chambers to just one was put up to a public vote in 1934, it was approved by a margin of 2-1. Now, this was the result of several factors. Norris's support had made the issue of a unicameral very popular, but 1934 was also the middle of the Great Depression, and much of the public thought that by reducing the size of the local government, it would also reduce its costs and allow the money to be used to better help the people. The other two questions on the ballot also possibly influenced the desire of many Nebraskans to want change, with one being the repeal of over a decade of prohibition, and the other being the legalization of betting on horse races, which both got overwhelming approval. Another factor was that the 1933 legislative session was seen as being extremely ineffective in helping the public deal with the Great Depression, and as many of the legislators opposed the unicameral system, it possibly resulted in the public reacting against them by supporting it. Once the new unicameral was formally established in 1937, the over 100-person legislature was reduced to just 30 members, with new rules being put in place, saying that as the state grew, it could go up to 50, and one of the first 30 legislators was the Democrat, John N. Norton, who had tried to get the unicameral established 18 years ago in 1919. The new legislature, in addition to being unicameral, differed from other states by requiring all members to be nonpartisan, so that when voters go to elect new candidates to the unicameral, their ballots do not show if they belong to any political party, or none, by being an independent. However, at the same time, political parties are free to sponsor and campaign for candidates of their choice, and the candidates are also free to belong to political parties, so that when the public go to the polls, they're often aware of which candidates belong to which party, even if the legislature itself won't officially recognize or list candidate affiliations. But in spite of this, it also helps the news and other websites often clearly identify candidates by party affiliation. Since there's only one chamber of government, further checks and balances have been put in place when introducing bills into the unicameral. To get the process started, any individual or group of citizens in Nebraska can advocate for new policies to create a new law, modify an existing law, or repeal an old law. Nebraska is also a single subject rule state, meaning that one piece of legislation can only cover one topic at a time. This prevents bills from including too many different changes to the law from being passed all at once. A state senator in the unicameral must then adopt the idea and work with the research division in the legislature to outline the idea into a more concrete policy. This is then brought to a bill drafter, who works with the senator to draft the policy into a bill. Once prepared, the senator then brings the bill into the unicameral, where the clerk of the legislature reads the title of the proposed bill into the record. The fiscal office then does research on how great of an impact the bill will have on either costing or saving the government money. A reference committee, composed of 9 state senators, will then look over the proposed bill and recommend it to one of the 14 standing committees based on the subject of the bill, which can cover anything from agriculture to education. The standing committee then holds public hearings where any member of the public can either testify or submit comments supporting or criticizing the bill. After the public hearing, the standing committee has 4 options: amend the bill based on public feedback and send it to the unicameral, leave the bill as is and send it to the unicameral, postpone the bill indefinitely, or do nothing. If it is sent to the Unicameral, then all state senators will have the opportunity to debate it, amend it, and vote on the bill during the first 2 rounds. If the bill passes both times with more than 50% of the senators supporting it, the legislature will then have to wait 1 day before holding a final vote. If it is passed, the bill is then sent to the governor, who then has 3 options. If they choose to sign the bill or do nothing, then it becomes a law. However, if they veto the bill, it is then sent back to the Unicameral, where they will need a 2/3 majority vote to overturn the veto. If this is done, the bill will finally become a law. For local elections, Nebraska uses a top 2 primary system, meaning that the state is first divided into several local districts, and anyone who has lived in the district for at least a year, is 21 years old, and is registered to vote can run for office, with the most common background for legislators being lawyers, businessmen, or farmers. During the first round of voting, any and all candidates can run for a seat in the Unicameral. Once the results are in, the top 2 candidates with the most votes go on to a second round against each other, with the winner of that election being elected to the Nebraska Unicameral. However, this system does have some issues. For example, if multiple people from the same political party run in the same race, it can split the majority vote and allow 2 members of opposition parties to be sent to the general election, even though they got a minority of the vote. This will then result in there only being 1 political party to vote for during election time. In spite of the hopes that this unicameral and nonpartisan system would create a more neutral legislature, political polarization has steadily begun to increase over the past 20 years in the unicameral, and one factor may have been the implementation of term limits in 2006. In the past, competitive races for the unicameral went from happening maybe once a decade for a couple seats, while today they now happen across the entire state almost every 4 to 8 years, as these new term limits require new candidates to come in. Before then, a legislator could stay in office indefinitely as long as they kept winning re-election, with prominent legislators such as Ernie Chambers having served in the unicameral since 1971. And while this made it harder for newer candidates and younger voices to easily enter the chamber, it allowed existing legislators to work for decades on crafting long-term legislation for the state, instead of having to win short-term political victories in order to get re-elected. Under the new term limit system, an individual can only serve 2 consecutive 4-year terms, meaning that if they would want to serve again, they would have to wait 4 years to run in the next election cycle. This caused many of the long-term legislators to leave office shortly after 2006, as they couldn't run again until the next election cycle, allowing a new wave of candidates to come in. This led almost half of the unicameral to be made up of first-termers after 2006, whereas before, only about 1/5 of the legislators were first-termers from year to year. This has caused some Nebraskans to be concerned that this term limit system may have led many candidates to enter the unicameral without any governing experience, and to then force them out once they have gotten it. Therefore, a few proposals have been floated around to either extend the term limit system to 3 4-year terms, or getting rid of the term limit system entirely. And while these term limits have led a younger generation of politicians to enter government, this constant cycle of elections have also given activists from special interest groups, wealthy donors, and both the established Republican and Democratic parties more power to choose new candidates for the unicameral, as these newer candidates need more volunteers, money, and a stronger campaign organization from these groups in order to be elected. And as a result, these groups tend to fund and support candidates that can serve better partisan interests, as opposed to the interests of the greater state as a whole. While being a relatively small state, Nebraska's politics are incredibly complex, and it comes with its own fascinating history. With this video just scratching the surface, I'm sure there's much more to go into, and probably some things I've missed, so please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I hope to catch you next time.